All right, well, we're going to get started. I'm Randy Anderson, and on behalf of the leadership here at Science, Scripture, and Reason, welcome to our February 2026 meeting. We're delighted to have you here, and we're particularly delighted to have Rick Gerhardt with us this evening. For those of you who don't know Rick, he is a research conservation ecologist specializing in birds of prey. He's also a teacher and a Christian apologist, and he has graduate degrees in ornithology and in philosophy theology, and his speaking and writing reflects broad interest in these topics. He's authored or co-authored nearly two dozen. What happened? Okay, you might mute yourself, those of you out there, besides Rick. He has authored or co-authored 24 scientific journal articles and book chapters on his field subjects, and has traveled throughout the Americas and the Caribbean, conducting research and presenting his results. He's taught a number of graduate college level courses and online courses, including General Apologetics, Science in the Bible, Christianity and the Life of the Mind, Creation Care and Reasons Institute courses, Creation versus Evolution, Origins of Life, Critical Thinking in a Messy World, and Origins of Humanity. And that's how I met Rick, because I had the privilege of being one of his students in Creation versus Evolution, and then in Clear Thinking in a Messy World. And because I found him to be both a very thoughtful and knowledgeable person and a really excellent teacher, I asked him to come, and he politely said yes. So we're really happy to have Rick here. He lives in Central Oregon with his wife Dawn, and they've raised their 4 children there. And he also has a number of farm animals. So he is a man not just studying the birds, but he's also studying farm animals and pets, I understand. So Rick, we're delighted to have you here tonight, and we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Randy, for inviting me, and Jim and Julie for helping make it happen. And thank you to all of you who are here, either online or in person there, for being here instead of out eating pancakes or whatever you usually do on Mardi Gras. A little bit of preliminaries, and then I'll jump into my PowerPoint slides, and you won't have to look at me for the next hour or so. But I do want to say that the material I'm going to cover, I could spend 4 or 6 weeks on, so it might seem a little bit like I'm slacking your thirst with a fire hose, but I'll speak fast, but there'll be time for questions at the end. I do believe that there's a whole lot of theological and biblical reasons for rejecting the evolutionary tale of the record of life on Earth, but I'm not going to talk about that almost at all. Instead, I'm going to look at the philosophical and scientific arguments. And I definitely want to talk about most of the main icons of evolution, as Jonathan Wells calls them in his book by that name, which are the kind of the textbook reasons why we're expected to believe in evolution. And I definitely want to hit the big picture, which is maybe the main 2 arguments that your evolutionary friend would give if you asked him why he believes in evolution, and that would be, the fossil record and the similarity of genetics of all living things. So we'll cover that among other things. And with that, I'll try to share my screen and get right into my presentation. I've called this Biologist's Critique of Evolution. Does everything look normal on your end, Randy?
Yes, that's great. It's good.
Okay. I've called this a critique of evolution, and I do want to get to all those main arguments and sets of evidence that evolutionists raise as to why we should believe evolutionism to be true. But I want to begin with a very particular argument because it'll offer me a springboard for launching into some of the many problems that are typically associated with evolutionary arguments. And this is Richard Dawkins' proof of evolution from the laryngeal nerve of the giraffe. Okay, so Dawkins claims that the way the laryngeal nerve reaches the larynx of the giraffe is a bad design or a suboptimal arrangement and is what one would expect from evolution, but not from a creator designer. That is, natural selection is allowed to cobble things together, but God is not. And as I say, he touts this as proof of evolution. So I'm going to, in a minute, give you what I take to be 7 fatal proofs, fatal flaws with this argument. But before I do that, I want to make it clear that if you were to watch Richard Dawkins presenting this on his YouTube video, it can be quite persuasive. That is, he's the famous Richard Dawkins is surrounded by white-coated lab assistants with the dissection of a full-grown giraffe there on the table. What could be more? What could be better science than this? But there are several problems with this claim. And the first one is that it involves a misunderstanding of how science works. So when Dawkins calls this proof of evolution, he's either ignorantly or intentionally making a claim that has nothing to do with the way science works. So logicians use philosophers use deductive arguments, and the result of a good deductive argument is, in fact, proof. But scientists mainly use inductive reasoning, and the best conclusion that inductive reasoning leads to is probability. And so we can't prove evolution, much less prove it from a single instance like this. But because evolutionary biology is a historical science, that is, it's not experimental or hard science like physics or cosmology or chemistry. What evolutionary biologists usually use is what's called abductive reasoning, which is looking at the fossil record and whatever other evidence there is and trying to argue that the best explanation for that evidence is evolution. And so when intelligent design proponents or old Earth creationists claim that instead what's going on there is repeated creation events, and we are accused of using a God of the gaps argument, well, no, what's happening is that we're using the exact same form of argumentation that is all that the evolutionary biologist uses and all that he has available to himself. A second problem is that Dawkins says this is what we would expect, and that's a confusing verb tense that is disingenuous. What he's trying to do here is imply that somehow evolutionists predicted this suboptimal arrangement of the giraffe's nerve, when that's not the case at all. Instead, this is an ad hoc, after the fact claim about what he perceives as bad design. The third problem is this is not a scientific argument at all, but a theological one. He says that God wouldn't do it this way. Now, Richard Dawkins is not a theologian. In fact, as an atheist, he presumably disqualifies himself of knowing or claiming anything about how God works or what God's purposes are. And so this is a case of an authority in one field making a claim that has nothing to do with that field. The fourth problem is that it implies a godlike knowledge of the situation. To say that this is bad design implies that he knows everything about the giraffe's neck and has ruled out all possibilities for there being either an optimization at issue here or some aspect of this that he's not getting. And so problem 5 is related to that. This kind of argument will never be anything more than a "it seems to me" sort of argument. Problem number 6 is a big one, and that is that such claims about bad design in living things or a vestigiality have invariably, upon further research, been shown to be false. That in fact, everything about living things turns out to be exquisitely designed or somehow an optimal compromise between different requirements. And this is the case also with this particular piece of evidence of the laryngeal nerve of the giraffe, but I won't have time to go into that right now. You'll have to remember to ask me about the design of the giraffe's neck in the Q&A period that follows. And then problem 7 is that this argument of Dawkins is logically fallacious. It involves a non sequitur. What I mean by that is that even if we grant that there's bad design, that doesn't lead to the conclusion that there's no design, which is really what Dawkins is hoping to get at. So back in the 1970s, there was a period where there was concern that the Ford Pinto had a bad fuel system that caused the gas tank to explode, even if the contact in the rear of the car was just a minor bump. Now, this idea has been disproven. It turns out to have been a myth, and I don't want to perpetuate that myth here. But my point for now is that in all of the resulting lawsuits and all of the research done into the Ford Pinto in the 70s, no one was ever claiming that because there might have been bad design, that the Ford Pinto wasn't designed at all. Okay? So before we go any further, let's talk about what really is at issue here. So Neo-Darwinism claims that natural selection working on random genetic mutations accounts for the diversity of all life through descent with modification. And as generally formulated and taught in our high schools and universities, Neo-Darwinism involves metaphysical naturalism. That is, the denial of anything that's not material or physical. That includes the denial of things like souls or even minds or mental processes, but it also includes a rejection of the idea of divine beings or of a God, a creator. One can, however, believe in biological evolution and still be a Christian. And so while much of my focus will be on the arguments made by theistic evolutionists, brothers and sisters in Christ who still believe in evolution, everything I say will also apply to the naturalistic version of this. So what we have as far as different views on life's diversity and how it came to be what it is are naturalistic evolutionism, as represented by Richard Dawkins, theistic evolutionism, or what they prefer to be called evolutionary creationists. And I'll say that that's divided into two different varieties. One would be a deistic variety, represented by Kenneth Miller, who would say that all God did was initiate the process of evolution. And he believes that, in fact, it would be clunky or beneath God's dignity to ever intervene in the subsequent unfolding of that evolution to change course or direct it in any way. The folks at Biologist would claim to be more of an interventionist variety. That is, they believe that God not only initiated the process of evolution, but that he somehow superintended it all along the way to achieve his purposes, including humankind, presumably. Now, while I've teased those out, I would suggest that in practical terms, there's really not that much difference between these two, because the folks at Biologist are pretty adamant that if God intervened, we can't observe or detect those interventions. And they tend to have very nasty things to say about intelligent design proponents, for example, who point to different places in the fossil record or in the makeup of living things today and say, this is evidence in favor of the requirement for an intelligent agent to bring causation here at this point. Okay? So really what I'm arguing for is a form of old earth creationism, whereby we believe that God intervened throughout the history of Earth to create new species at appropriate times when the conditions of the Earth came to be able to support those things. And then, of course, there's young Earth creationism, which believes more in an instantaneous creation of all living things. And I won't spend any time on that because that's not really what we're talking about tonight. So there's really a whole lot of agreement between theistic evolution and Neo-Darwinian evolution, and the only difference being that the theistic evolutionists give a nod to God somehow, but usually in an undetectable way. So they agree that the history of life on Earth has been a very gradual evolutionary change, and that there's a continuum of common ancestry between all living things right up to human beings. So again, the modern synthesis or neo-Darwinism claims that natural selection working on random genetic mutations accounts for the diversity of all living things through descent with modification, and the evolutionary creationist would agree with that claim. Now, I need to point out here that there is currently an epigenetic revolution taking place within biology, which is soon going to change the way we teach biology, the way we do biological research, and the way we think about the way evolution is taught in high schools and colleges. But that's all I'm going to say right now about that. And again, you'll have to remind me to talk more about that in the Q&A period, because what's been taught for the last several decades is Neo-Darwinianism, and that's what I'm going to be focusing my comments on tonight. So now I want to turn to a Christian brother who claims that there are 4 reasons why he believes in evolutionists. This is Dinesh D'Souza in his apologetic book, What's So Great About Christianity? And so he gives 4 reasons why he believes in evolution. And I want to address each of those. The first reason is that nearly all biologists accept evolution. And there are several problems with this claim. The first problem is that believers in evolution control academia and media and prohibit skepticism. That is, all of our popular science articles assume evolution to be true because the keeper of the keys, if you will, of biology in the academia believe it to be true. And a young person going into biology can lose all sorts of opportunities, including acceptance into a graduate program or funding or job or career or tenure, if he dares to express skepticism of the evolutionary tale. The second problem is that nonetheless, this claim that nearly all biologists accept evolution is false. It's untrue. There's a common story among those biologists who have broken away from Darwinism, hopefully when they already had tenure and then could say these things without without repercussions. But the common story is that, I knew all along that evolution wasn't really true in my own area of specialty, but I assumed and was taught that it had much greater support in all these other disciplines of biology. When I came to believe that that was not the case, that in effect I'd been lied to, I was really angry. Okay? The third problem is that every time there's been a revolution in science whereby an old paradigm has been discarded and rejected in favor of a new paradigm, there was just prior to that revolution a period of time in which the old paradigm was universally accepted, as D'Souza claims is true of evolution today. The fourth problem is that D'Souza is here guilty of the ad populum fallacy. That is, the truth of a claim is not dependent on a majority view or a raise of hands. The truth needs to be established on its true value, the evidence and the arguments, not by appealing to the popularity of an argument or claim. And closely related to this is a fifth problem, which is that D'Souza here suffers from a cognitive bias. And I want to camp here for a minute because I think this is a big deal and at the base of the fact that D'Souza can claim that nearly all biologists accept evolution. Thinking critically depends upon having skills in the areas of identifying and assessing and appropriating good arguments, good information. And most scientists would say that they've got skills in that aspect of critical thinking. But there's a more primary, a more foundational aspect to clear thinking, and that is having the skill to recognize and avoid the adverse effects of, or to overcome any cognitive biases that one might bring to the effort of the other form of critical thinking. And so the cognitive bias that D'Souza is guilty of here is what many have called the bandwagon bias. And that is that because everybody else in biology or in academia or every other thinking person that I know believes something, I'm going to believe it too. I dare not allow myself to truly test or critically examine the arguments and evidence that have been made in its favor. Okay, so I said just a minute ago that every revolution in science has been preceded by a period of universal acceptance. But Darwinian evolution is unprecedented in the magnitude and scope of its popularity. That is, shortly after Darwin proposed his theory, when it became accepted by the biological community, it led, first of all, to the rejection of the theistic underpinnings that made and still today make science a worthwhile endeavor. Now, that's a completely different lecture. But the next thing that occurred was that evolutionary thought began to pervade all other areas of academia, from psychology to sociology to religious belief, everything in between, such that today Darwinian evolution enjoys a more widespread and more deep momentum than any theory in scientific history. So that people like D'Souza and certainly the scientists at Biologist dare not allow themselves to examine very critically the arguments and evidences raised in support of evolution, because if they allow themselves to be at all skeptical of that paradigm, it would mean that they'd be shunned by everybody whose opinion they care about. Darwinian evolution is like the emperor's new clothes. The emperor is parading the streets with nothing on, but no one dare say that's the case for fear of being labeled a fool. Okay? So nearly all biologists accept evolution. Well, interestingly, Philip Skell, who was associated with the American Association of Scientists, conducted a survey of his biological colleagues. And the question was basically, if you came to believe that evolution was not true, would it have any bearing upon the way you do your research? And the overwhelming result was a resounding no. And so I'm going to share some quotes from Philip Skell as he reported his findings. The modern form of Darwinian. You still there? You still have my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I lost it. I have to get my screen back. I was trying to get rid of all your faces, which were covering up some of my screen, but no offense, Matt.
Well, we pretty much got rid of his.
Okay, where are we? There it is. The modern form of Darwin's theory has been raised to its present high status because it's said to be the cornerstone of modern experimental biology. But is that correct? While the great majority of biologists would probably agree with Dobzhansky's dictum that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, most can conduct their work quite happily without particular reference to evolutionary ideas. To put it in a nutshell, what Skell is saying here is evolutionary theory has no practical value. And I'll just give you an example of my own field of research, which is conservation biology. No one is waiting for the spotted owl or the snail darter to evolve in order to avoid extinction, because evolution is simply not something that happens in real time or in the real world in which we all live. Skell goes on to say, From my conversations with leading researchers, it had become clear that modern experimental biology gains its strength from the availability of new instruments and methodologies, not from an immersion in historical biology. So moving along and skipping over D'Souza's second and third reasons for the moment, his fourth reason for believing in evolution is that the history of life demonstrates an unending upward trajectory. He writes that one of the strongest proofs, again, there's that misunderstanding of how science works, for evolution is that the geological record, for all its imperfections, shows a single invariant trajectory. What he's saying here is that life started out as simple and has all along grown increasingly complex, and that is reason to believe that evolution was at work there. Okay? Problems with this is, first of all, that it's true only in the very most superficial sense. So there are bacteria alive today, for example, that are indistinguishable from the fossil bacteria that were the first forms of life on Earth 3.8 billion years ago. And so those bacteria didn't undergo evolution at all. They're still the same today, all that time later. And in fact, when we look closely at the fossil record, as we'll do in more depth in just a bit, it's one of sudden appearance, long periods of stasis with no upward trajectory, radiations, new bursts of creative activity, and chronological paradoxes, where a seemingly complex life form arises before what seems to be a simpler subsequent life form. And a better explanation of this invariant trajectory considers the changing conditions of Earth, which have been immense over the course of life's history on Earth. And so the design or creationist understanding of this upward trajectory would be that the Earth has been filled with increasingly complex life as soon as conditions have changed to be able to support those new complex forms of life. And I want to raise up Hugh Ross's name here. Most of you are familiar with the work of Hugh Ross and are probably grateful to Hugh for the amazing way in which he has synthesized all the latest discoveries in modern astronomy and physics and cosmology to show how they harmonize very well with the creation passages found throughout the Holy Bible. But as a biologist, I am so grateful to Hugh because I think his real cutting edge work has been in his synthesis of such varied disciplines as paleobiology and paleoclimatology and paleontology to show how the existing life and the conditions in which they live have worked along with those changing conditions to make subsequent life possible every step of the way, and to synthesize how the fact is that our Creator God has maximized both the amount and diversity of life given the changing conditions of the planet throughout Earth's history. So let's take a little bit of a sidetrack and talk about examples of evolution offered by evolutionists. When asked for evidence, evolutionists invariably offer examples of only microevolutionary change. And the example I want to share with you comes from my own undergraduate experience, and the example was green toothpicks. So in a spring lab in my biology class, Dr. M.D. Johnson, whom we referred to as Mad Dog Johnson, took us out into the quad where there was lush, uncut, well-fertilized green grass. And we scattered 4 boxes of toothpicks, each box being of a different color in that lush lawn. And then we students served as the predatory birds who were the agents of natural selection to see natural selection at work. And what we found was all of the yellow toothpicks, almost all of the red toothpicks, most of the blue toothpicks, and almost none of the green toothpicks because they were well camouflaged in that grass. Aha, natural selection at work. The problem is that the green toothpicks have much less genetic diversity than the original population of 4 different colored toothpicks, and therefore are much less likely to exhibit any adaptive advance. And yet, on the Neo-Darwinian macroevolutionary view, the remaining green toothpicks will eventually evolve into dental floss, toothbrushes, and electric toothbrushes. And this was the best example that Mad Dog Johnson could give us of natural selection at work. There's a problem there. Well, what about a real life example? So during the Industrial Revolution, there changes were observed in the proportions of typical, that is light gray, and melanistic or black peppered moths. And for decades, the cause of this change was unknown, some biologists suggesting that differences in camouflage led to varying degrees of depredation. But in the 1950s, Bernard Kettlewell performed some experiments on these moths and called his results Darwin's missing evidence, and the most striking evolutionary change ever actually witnessed in any organism. Sewell Wright wrote that this is the clearest case in which a conspicuous evolutionary process has actually been observed. But at best, this evidence supports only micro, not macro evolutionary change. And here's Philip Johnson's take on this. Why do other people, including experts whose intelligence and intellectual integrity I respect, think that evidence of local population fluctuations confirms the hypothesis that natural selection has the capacity to work engineering marvels to construct wonders like the eye and the wing? Everyone who studies evolution knows that Kettlewell's peppered moth experiment is the classic demonstration of the power of natural selection, and the Darwinists had to wait almost a century to see even this modest confirmation of their central doctrine. Everyone who studies the experiment knows that it has nothing to do with the origin of any species or even any variety, because dark and white moths were present throughout the experiment. Only the ratios of one variety to the other changed. How could intelligent people have been so gullible as to imagine that the Kettlewell experiment in any way supported the ambitious claims of Darwinism? There's several other problems with this claim that this demonstrates evolution in action. There were many geographic discrepancies. Experimental moths were released by day, but the moths are only active at night. Return to normal populations preceded the return of healthy lichens. Other species that underwent industrial melanism like this are not eaten by birds. Peppered moths don't even rest on tree trunks, but up in the foliage. At any rate, according to Sermani and Catastini, Kettlewell's experiments, quote, do not prove in any acceptable way, according to the current scientific standard, the process he maintains to have experimentally demonstrated. The evidence Darwin lacked, Kettlewell lacked as well. But I include this because it's still one of those things that are taught as reasons why we should believe in evolution. Other real-life examples to which evolutionists appeal are likewise only microevolution, changes within a species. These include the development of antibiotic resistance in bacteria and of pesticide resistance in insects, and changes in beak sizes of Darwin's finches. But the bacteria, the insects, and the finches remain the same species. They exhibit no macroevolutionary change, and evolutionary theory does not explain the origin of the bacteria, the insects, or finches, even though that's exactly what Darwin's theory was supposed to do. So the finches in the Galapagos Islands are another one of these textbook icons of evolution. And the idea that Darwin's theory was inspired by these finches is modern myth. It's not true. Real-time studies since have documented changes in the beak sizes related to changes in the environment. So in a year of very dry weather where the rain didn't come, beak sizes tend to be larger and heavier in the subsequent generation to handle larger seeds that are more adapted to the dry conditions and such like. But these changes oscillate around the mean. As the studies continue, those larger beak sizes revert back to the normal size once rains come in subsequent generations of finches. Okay, so they oscillate around the mean rather than remaining directional. But textbooks tout and extrapolate the original change and omit to mention the fact that there is a reversal back to the mean. Philip Johnson says about this that when our leading scientists have to resort to the sort of distortion that would land a stock promoter in jail, you know they're in trouble. In recent years, increasing instances of hybridization among these finch species has been recorded, so that the 14 different species of Galapagos finches may really be only 6 species or even fewer. In other words, these birds are exhibiting the opposite pattern of the one that evolutionary theory requires. And this highlights a problem for Neo-Darwinism, and that is the limits of selection. Darwin theorized that natural selection acted in the same way as dog breeders act. And the problem with this argumentation is that there is a limit to the variation that even intentional breeding can produce. We can produce teacup poodles and Great Danes, but we can't go any further in getting smaller or larger, no matter how much intentional breeding we use. Another problem is that those individuals furthest from the mean, like teacup poodles and Great Danes, are in fact less fit, meaning less likely to survive in the wild, less likely to have successful matings, and certainly less likely to reproduce and survive when intentional breeding is stopped. So when artificial breeding is stopped, and even these extreme examples of dogs are allowed to interbreed with whatever other dog they might like, natural breeding quickly reverts to closer to the mutt or the mean. So there are well-defined limits to the selection that even intentional breeding can produce, and certainly also to the sort of changes that natural selection can do. So 150 years after Darwin, we now know that natural selection, rather than producing new characteristics or species, or even new tissues or cell types or organs, instead works to keep species from straying far from the characteristics of its type. So this is another quote from Philip Skell. Evolution is not a characteristic of living organisms. What modern experimental biologists study are the mechanisms by which living organisms maintain their stability without evolving. Organisms oscillate about a median state, and if they deviate significantly from that state, they die. It has been research on these mechanisms of stability, not research guided by Darwin's theory, which has produced the major fruits of modern biology and medicine. And so I ask again, why do we invoke Darwin? So now we'll return to Dinesh D'Souza's reasons number 2 and 3 for believing in evolution. Evolution explains both the differences and the similarities among living things. He says the great strength of evolution as a scientific theory is that it makes sense of 2 huge facts about life. On the one hand, all living things from trees to cats to humans are formed from the same genetic material. Beyond this, it is evident that many groups of organisms show similar characteristics, so there is a unity to life. At the same time, living things exhibit incredible diversity. Evolution accounts both for the similarities and the differences, according to Dinesh D'Souza. But here he misunderstands the evidence and the arguments on both of these issues of similarity and difference. So to begin with, the view that all living things are designed by a single creator has always been a powerful explanation for both the similarities and the differences. In fact, Darwin himself proposed his theory not to explain the similarities, but in order to explain away the differences. That is, he avoided the argument from similarity because he knew what I've just said, that the view that all living things are designed by a single creator has powerful explanatory power for those similarities. So he meant to explain away the differences by postulating an inconceivably great number of transitional forms bridging the hierarchies into which life as we know it fits. Okay? So evolution has failed to explain those differences, as we'll see when we talk more in depth about the fossil record. And so it is disingenuous and fallacious of modern evolutionists to use similarities as evidence for evolution. So they forget that there is this alternative explanation that Darwinism was proposed in order to supplant and act as though it's not there. But common design creation still explains those similarities just as well or better than does common ancestry. Okay? The Bible has always proclaimed that all living things are made of the same physical stuff, what it calls the dust of the earth. And it's just a well-established fact that the material stuff from which all living things are made is the same elements that exist on this rocky planet. So that all living things are similar in their physical makeup is no surprise to the Christian or to the believer in the Bible's accounts. And this circular reasoning on the part of the evolutionist who uses similarities as proof of his argument is highlighted by what's come to be known as Barra's blunder. So in the 1970s, or 1990, Tim Barra, writing in a book, Evolution and the Myth of Creationism, wrote, if you compare a 1953 and a 1954 Corvette side by side, and then a 1954 and a 1955 model, and so on, the descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. This is what paleontologists do with fossils, and the evidence is so solid and comprehensive that it cannot be denied by reasonable people. Do you see the problem here? We all know that the Corvettes, to which he refers for his analogy, were not the result of descent with modification by some sort of naturalistic mechanism, but were in fact designed and manufactured by an intelligent agent. So not only did Barra here prove the exact opposite of what he was hoping to prove, but this problem was overlooked by presumably a great number of his evolutionary colleagues and editors who allowed it to stand like this, in spite of the fact that it seems to argue for the exact opposite point of what evolutionists like Tim Barra wanted to make of it. The similarity between living things is better explained in a top-down approach, which is theological. So to get my meaning here, I should talk a little more about the hierarchies. So all living things, both those that are extant today and those in the fossil record, can be grouped into hierarchies of similarity. So that, for instance, all mammals share a set of characteristics that sets them apart from, distinguishes them from all lizards and birds, or reptiles and birds and fish and everything else that's not a mammal, right? But within the hierarchy of mammals, there are groupings. Let's take the bats, for example, in which all bats share a set of characteristics like long, hollow bones and thin membranous wings that set them up, and echolocation that set them apart from all other mammals. So there are these hierarchies that are distant, that have gaps between them that need to be explained by evolutionary theory. And Darwin's whole purpose was to explain those gaps by filling them with fossil examples of transitional species that bridge the gap between bats and whatever the closest ancestor, according to evolution, might be. Okay? You understand the hierarchical nature of life and what needs to be explained. And so a top-down approach, a creationist, intelligent design approach, has the further strength of doing justice to the hierarchies of similarity. And what I mean there is that on a design creation view, all these characteristics of a bat contribute in an exceptionally designed way to bathood. And all of the mammals that don't share the long, hollow bones of a bat forearm and don't share all these other characteristics that contribute to bathood don't share those characteristics because they wouldn't contribute to rodenthood or whatever it is these other mammals have. Okay, Whereas on a Darwinian view of bats, bathood comes to mean relatively little, and all of the interest is in the underlying genes, which somehow are supposed to have bridged the gap between a non-bat and a bat. Okay, so a top-down teleological approach, that is a design creation approach, does justice to the hierarchies and to the organisms that make up those hierarchies in a way that evolutionism really doesn't do anymore. So I've shared bats as an example of the hierarchical nature of life on Earth. The similarity between all living things is also better explained as ecological necessity, which is an explanation that also assumes purpose and design. What I mean here is that when we look at life on Earth, what we see is one great big ecosystem in which all the individuals and all the species rely upon the other individuals that make up their ecosystem. And so for just one or two examples, the iron that is now today flowing through my blood, a necessary part of my circulatory system, was last week doing duty in the broccoli that I had last night for dinner. If all living things didn't share the same makeup, the same chemical and protein makeup, then the whole ecosystem would shut down or require innumerable other layers of organs and systems in order to take advantage of other life forms. Right? And the air that the oxygen that is in your lungs today was yesterday being released to the air by the houseplant that sits in the corner of your living room. So all living things share the same stuff, the same material component. And so it's ecological necessity that helps to explain that similarity. I hope you're following me. And because of that, medical researchers and nutritionists assume that same sort of teleological and ecological view. They don't go looking for nutritional supplements or the cure for cancer only in organisms that are closely related to us. Instead, if you walk into your local pharmacy, what you'll find is that there are components that were originally found and synthesized from all sorts of different fungi and plants and living things that have no relation to us whatsoever. And so Philip Skell again says, most innovations are not guided by grand paradigms, but by far more modest testable hypotheses. And recognizing this, neither medical schools nor pharmaceutical firms maintain divisions of evolutionary science. Again, evolution is just a theory that has no practical application. So, has evolutionary theory succeeded in explaining the differences between hierarchies of living things? Let's look at the argument from the fossil record where this should be found. Except in the most superficial way, the fossil record does not support evolutionary theory. Darwin himself wrote that at the time, the fossil evidence was the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. That is, he recognized these hierarchies that were separated from one another, and he proposed to undo that problem. He called the present evidence from the fossils the reason all the most eminent paleontologists and all our greatest geologists have unanimously, often vehemently, maintained the immutability, that is, the unchangeability of species. And in Darwin's time, two aspects of the fossil record were most obviously at odds with his theory. One was the absence of transitional intermediates, these life forms that would bridge those hierarchical gaps. And about this, Darwin wrote that the number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. The second problem is the sudden appearance of living things fully formed and fully adapted to their time on Earth and their environments. And this problem was exemplified and acknowledged by Darwin by the Cambrian explosion, a brief period starting 530 million years ago, in which nearly all animal phyla arose suddenly and without ancestors or precursors. Regarding the Cambrian explosion, Darwin wrote, "The case at present must remain inexplicable and may truly be urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained." But though the fossil record contradicted his theory, Darwin didn't see this as fatal. He believed that because paleontology was a young science, further digging would uncover the necessarily vast number of fossil transitional forms and lessen the extent and significance and suddenness of the Cambrian explosion. So Philip Johnson writes, there was a way to test his theory by fossil evidence. The test would not be fair to the skeptics, however, unless it was also possible for the theory to fail. Imagine, for example, that belief in Darwin's theory were to sweep through the scientific world with such irresistible power that it very quickly became an orthodoxy. Suppose that paleontologists became so committed to the new way of thinking that fossil studies were published only if they supported the theory and were discarded as failures if they showed an absence of evolutionary change. As we shall see in the remainder of Johnson's book, that is what happened. Darwinism apparently passed the fossil test, but only because it was not allowed to fail. And several bold modern paleontologists have agreed with Johnson. They say that the fossil record is adequate and does not support Darwin's theory. So the late Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote that the history of most fossil species includes two features particularly inconsistent with Darwinian gradualism. Stasis, the fact that species appear in the fossil record looking the exact same as when they disappear, and sudden appearance. A species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. Stephen Stanley, who was in charge of research at Bighorn Basin, Wyoming, where a continuous record of deposits covering millions of years led to the expectation of the finding of Darwin's transitional forms, wrote in conclusion that the fossil record does not convincingly document a single transition from one species to another. And Niles Eldredge wrote that we paleontologists have said that the history of life supports the Darwinian story of gradual adaptive change, all the while really knowing that it does not. And Gould again referred to the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record as the trade secret of paleontology. So let me get back to the bats. Bats arose on Earth 52 million years ago, and paleontologists have more than 1,000 fossil bats from as long ago as that, many of them very well preserved and showing even stomach contents. And the current evolutionary theory is that the nearest ancestor to bats is a tree shrew. Okay, it's really interesting. It turns out that genetically, which is the way that modern taxonomists use to classify living things and make their evolutionary trees and such, on a genetic basis, bats are most closely related to things like hippos and whales. But let's, for the sake of argument, go with a tree shrew, because you can at least think that there might have been some sort of bridge between them and bats. But even with the massive amount of good fossil records of bats going all the way back to 52 million years ago, there are zero fossils of anything that could be construed as anywhere along the continuous gap between a tree shrew and a bat. Okay? Well, what about Archaeopteryx, the dino-bird transition? 2 years after The Origin of Species was written, Hermann von Meyer discovered the first fossil Archaeopteryx, and it was immediately, and is still often today, hailed as the evidence Darwin's theory lacked. As recently as 1982, Ernst Mayr called it the almost perfect link between reptiles and birds. And so for many today, Archaeopteryx functions in the place of the inconceivably great number of intermediates that Darwin predicted would be found to support his theory. But in fact, Archaeopteryx is now regarded by paleontologists and taxonomists as a true bird and not ancestral to any modern birds. There is no agreement on its ancestors, and the dinosaurs most often proposed for that role appear much later in the fossil record, which is a problem. So evolutionists remain desperate to find its replacement for the needed role of missing link between reptiles and birds. And this has led to some embarrassing incidents, as when in 1999, National Geographic published research on a dino-bird transition that subsequently proved to be a forgery. Ornithologist Alan Fiducia predicts that the theory that birds evolved from dinosaurs will prove to be, quote, the greatest embarrassment of paleontology of the 20th century. As for the Cambrian explosion, it is now recognized as more sudden in its onset and involving more phyla than was known in Darwin's day. That is, that what he recognized as a big problem for his theory has only grown worse with 150 years of fossil digging subsequently. According to Valentine et al., all living phyla may have originated by the end of the explosion. And Meyer et al. Say that at present, paleontologists lack clear ancestral precursors for the representatives of not just one new phylum, but virtually all the phyla of the Cambrian explosion. Contrary to Darwin's hope, however, in the 150 years since the publication of The Origin, discoveries in paleontology have only made the puzzle of the Cambrian explosion more acute. Not only have expected transitional forms not turned up, but the pattern of the sudden appearance of novel structure has become more pronounced. Massive new fossil discoveries have documented many previously unknown Cambrian phyla, thus only increasing the number of expected and missing transitional intermediates required on a Darwinian account of the emergence of new living forms. Richard Dawkins uses two series of transitional fossils to support his evolutionary theory in his apologetic book, The Greatest Show on Earth. And those are the hippo to whale series, I should have put series in quotes, and the fish to amphibian series. And of course, these have problems as well, and I'll identify 7 or 8. One problem specifically for the whale evolution idea is that different sets of evidence, fossil, morphological, and genetic, yield contrary conclusions about what is the closest ancestor to whale. And this is certainly a problem. Problem 2 is that a great diversity of whales appeared suddenly in really the blink of geological time, with no changes having occurred since that sudden appearance, no subsequent evolution of whales. Problem 3 is that on all demographic parameters, whales are the least likely candidates for adaptation or evolution, and the most likely candidates to go extinct. That is, whales have very small population sizes, very long intergenerational times, very low reproductive output, very specialized habitat requirements, specialized food requirements. And so their likelihood of being able to adapt or evolve is nil. And so they're the very worst candidate that one could pick to provide evidence for an evolutionary series. Whereas a design explanation for the diversity of whales that we see is much more satisfactory. Whales have a huge role to play today in the ecology of seas and coastlines, and even in the functioning of the atmosphere in maintaining survivable surface temperatures on Earth. With regard to these half amphibian, half fish fossils like Ichthyostega and Tiktaalik, the transitional intermediates that Dawkins and others say prove evolution, a number of problems exist here too. None of the fossils in the series are transitional in any way. All are fully adapted for their time on Earth and for the ecologies of which they were a part. The fifth problem is that fossils cannot, in principle, establish ancestor-descendant relationships. Gareth Nelson of the American Museum of Natural History wrote that the idea that one can go to the fossil record and expect to empirically recover an ancestor-descendant sequence, be it of species, genera, families, or whatever, has been and continues to be a pernicious illusion. The way Henry G. says it is, no fossil is buried with its birth certificate. That and the scarcity of fossils means that it is effectively impossible to link fossils into chains of cause and effect in any valid way, as Dawkins and others attempt to do with these so-called series. A sixth problem is that these series involve chronological and geographic paradoxes. Chronological meaning that some of the supposed ancestors actually appear in the fossil record ahead of their alleged descendants. And geographic paradoxes mean that these seemingly linked by common descent fossils are found in completely different parts of the Earth's fossil record. And then there are a couple of statistical anomalies or fallacies that come into play here. The birthday paradox is a statistical anomaly that basically is the recognition that in order to find two people who share the same birthday, there need only be 23 people present. And this statistical anomaly plays upon the fact that the different ways of matching up 23 different people one-to-one exceeds half of the number of days in the calendar, 365. So it only takes 23 people together to have a better than 50% chance that two of them share the same birthday. And how this bears upon the argument from fossil transitional series is given 500 million species of animal life on Earth, it is mere child's play to link some of them together in a pattern that seems to you to have meaning, but may in fact not have any meaning at all. And the fallacy, this statistical fallacy involved in this kind of reasoning is what's known as the file drawer effect. So take, for example, the idea that you flipped a coin 10,000 times and recorded every result. And, you know, the result was somewhere near, but not exactly 5,000 heads to 5,000 tails. And then you filed the results of that experiment away in a drawer. Along comes somebody, looks at the results in the file drawer, picks out a series of 10, a run of 10 straight heads, and concludes that the entire record is nothing but heads, which is exactly the opposite of the actual result. This is what's known as the statistical fallacy of the file drawer effect. And keeping in mind what those modern paleontologists that I quoted said about no transitional forms in the fossil record, Dawkins's claim here is guilty of the file drawer effect, even if we were to grant that there was some meaningful relationship between the wolf to whale series or the hippo to whale series or the fish to amphibian series. That's not characteristic of the entire fossil record, which shows just the opposite. No such common ancestry. I feel like I need to share the evidence of homology again because it's a textbook example. So evolutionists promote the fact that the forearm of the bat and the horse and the monkey and the dog all share the same bone structure, and that somehow this is evidence for evolution. Again, Darwin himself didn't use this argument because he recognized that a common design explanation was just as powerful in this regard. And so this argument from evolutionism is viciously circular since they first define homology by reference to it arising from evolution. So independent evidence that such structures arose from common ancestry could come from the fossil record or from the underlying genes, from embryology or from evo-devo, which is evolutionary developmental biology, but such independent evidence has not been found. And so Ronald Brady, I really want you to hear this quote, says that by making our explanation into the definition of the condition to be explained, we express not scientific hypothesis, but belief. We are so convinced that our explanation is true that we no longer see any need to distinguish it from the situation we were trying to explain. Dogmatic endeavors of this kind must eventually leave the realm of science. And while Brady's remarks here are specifically about this argument from homologous structure, the very same thing could be said about the evolutionary argument from the fossil record. Evolutionists tend to conflate the fact of change over time in what forms of life existed on the planet with their explanation for that change, which is common descent and evolutionary gradualism. Okay. So this is Michael Denton, who is not a Christian or even a theist in particular. He's just a biochemist who's looking very neutrally at the arguments and claims of evolutionism. Macroevolutionists, continuous evolutionary development through the selection of random mutations is not supported by findings in any area of biology. The theory is supported neither by empirical evidence nor by thought experiments. It is the priority of the paradigm that renders these Darwinian problems and anomalies invisible. This is Denton's way of saying there's a cognitive bias at issue here that prevents these evolutionists, whether theistic or naturalistic, from seeing the problems with their arguments and evidence. He goes on to say, for the skeptic or indeed to anyone prepared to step out of the circle of our Darwinian belief, it is not hard to find inversions of common sense in modern evolutionary thought, which are strikingly reminiscent of the mental gymnastics of the phlogiston chemists or the medieval astronomers, referring to past scientific paradigms that have been since rejected. He goes on to say, one might have expected that a theory of such cardinal importance, a theory that literally changed the world, would have been something more than metaphysics, something more than a myth. Ultimately, the Darwinian theory of evolution is no more nor less than the great cosmogenic myth of the 20th century. In the final analysis, we still know very little about how new forms of life arise. The mystery of mysteries, the origin of new beings on Earth, is still largely as enigmatic as when Darwin set sail on the Beagle. So I want to finish with the question of does biologos offer any separate or different arguments than the ones we've already looked at and found dubious or vacuous? For the most part, Francis Collins, Dennis Venema, Daryl Falk, Deb Harsman, and the like at Biologos uncritically accept the same evidence that we have just examined. In addition, they seem convinced of common ancestry and Neo-Darwinian gradualism, primarily because of the similarity in genetic makeup of all living things, and particularly of the common ancestry between humans and, say, other monkeys and such. In particular, their main argument, the one that they find themselves at the last ditch fighting when all these other arguments have been refuted, seems to be that pseudogenes like Sigulo, endogenous retroviruses, and other so-called junk DNA prove common ancestry and gradual evolution. And there are a number of problems with this argument as well. And the first problem is, again, a misunderstanding of how science works. Again, they claim that this proves common ancestry and gradual evolution, whereas scientific argumentation is impotent to prove anything. Problem two is that arguments from similarity are fallaciously circular, as I've already shown you in other areas. Common design is a powerful explanatory alternative. Problem three is that this is a theological and not a scientific claim. And I hope you see what I'm doing here. I'm applying to these theistic evolution arguments the same set of arguments that were fatal to Dawkins's giraffe neck argument. This is a claim about what God would and would not do. It's not a scientific claim, it's a theological claim. Problem four, it implies that we know everything there is to know about why there is found a similar Sigulo gene in apes and humanity, and we don't know that. Problem five is that it will never be more than a seems to me sort of subjective argument. Problem six is that such claims invariably upon further research are refuted. And this has been the case with each of these so-called junk DNA examples to which the Biologos folks point. Problem seven is that we have found no other evidence or reason to accept that evolution is a good explanation for the diversity of life as we see it in the fossil record and in living things today. And with that, here's some of the main folks that I quoted from, books that I quoted from. And you'll see that these are mainly intelligent design proponents rather than specifically RTB or old Earth creation proponents. And I I did that intentionally because I think most of you are more familiar with RTB and its books and resources, and so I wanted to make sure to expose you to some of the thinking of the intelligent design folks in that way. And with that, I'll unshare my screen and turn it back to allow you to. Did I unshare?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good.
And thank you. That was probably the most comprehensive and well presented critique of evolution that I've heard. So that was wonderful.
It wasn't any of it original to me.
Well, you put it together very well, so I really appreciate it, Rick. Thank you so much. We have time for questions, so I'll open the floor up. Anyone on Zoom or here in the room?
Well, while you're thinking of your questions, let me say one thing that I meant to say and didn't. D'Souza referred specifically to the similarity in genetics of all living things. So I need to address that. And I don't want to address it at length because Dr. Fuz Rana has done really good work in demonstrating how exquisitely designed the universal genetic code is. And I would refer you to his resources on that. But really, the fact that all living things share the same universal genetic code is more of a problem for evolution than it is an asset. And that is partly because it appears that the earliest living life form shared that same genetic code, that as well designed and as exquisitely designed and efficient the universal genetic code is, it was there at the beginning of life, full blown, all those billions of years ago, and that's a huge problem for evolutionists.
I will start out by asking you to comment more on the epigenetics. You mentioned that the revolution is already occurring and that the Neo-Darwinians are going to have to change their ideas, and it's going to impact our understanding as well. So could you elaborate more on that?
So epigenetics, well, it probably grew out of a discipline called evo-devo. And so as evolutionary biology was becoming recognized as unable to explain several things, including the fact that every cell in your body contains essentially the same DNA, the same genetic blueprint, and yet your body is somehow capable of taking that same nucleus of DNA and producing from it all sorts of different cell types, different tissues and organisms from the exact same DNA. And evolutionary biology doesn't explain that. And evolutionary biology really doesn't explain how new species arise. And so there was a new discipline that arose 20, 30 years ago called evo-devo, evolutionary developmental biology. And it was meant to resurrect the power of evolutionism. And the hypothesis was that, well, maybe it's the genes that control development, the genes that control embryology that are the big deal. And evo-devo utterly failed in achieving that promise, because it turns out that the genes that control evolutionary development are really similar across vastly different organisms, from the sea urchin to humans type thing. But what that new discipline led to was the recognition that the central dogma of biochemistry, of biology, for the last many decades was naive and simplistic and needed to be reevaluated. So the central dogma is just this idea that it's the genes that that code for the RNA, which that then goes to the ribosome and puts together the proteins that in turn make you what you are, make every individual and every species what they are, that's the whole story. Genes to RNA, DNA to RNA to proteins to the makeup of individuals. That's the central dogma. And what this new field of epigenetics is discovering is a couple of things. First of all, that there's a whole lot more going inside the cell that actually works to ensure that random genetic mutations, those things that provide the grist for Neo-Darwinian evolution, the rest of the cell has multiple error discovery and correction mechanisms by which those random mutations don't result in the production of different proteins. But it also involves the recognition that there's a whole lot more going outside the genes, outside the nucleus, in the cell membranes and other things that affect inheritance. Okay? So epigenetics really just means above or on top of genetics. So whereas we've always believed, especially under a Darwinian evolutionary view, that it's the genes that are the genome that is inherited by subsequent generations, we now know that within an individual's lifetime, there can be changes made without really observable differences in the genome that affect the expression at the protein level. So basically think of these epigenetic effects as off-on switch or dimmer switches that enable the amount of proteins to be produced, a change in the amount of a protein to be produced, or the turning off of the production of that protein. So the genome looks the same. It doesn't look like there's a new gene there, but there's been a change, and it's an epigenetic change. And that epigenetic change can be passed on to the next generation. And not only that, but these epigenetic sorts of changes to the genome can occur simultaneously within an entire population in response to a new environmental change. Okay? So the evolutionist is going to pick up on this and say, oh, hey, we don't need to wait for this single genetic change in this one couple to pass through several generations before it becomes spread through the population, which was always a really clunky part of Darwinian of the Darwinian explanation. But in fact, these epigenetic changes can occur across the individuals of a single population simultaneously and be passed on to the next generation. Now, I need to point out right here that this has powerful explanatory explanation for microevolution, but has no more power on a macroevolutionary sense than did the old clunky mechanism of random mutations in the Neo-Darwinian. But I did need you to understand that the way biology and evolution are being taught is already changing within the university and will soon be changing within the high school science teaching as well. But it doesn't provide any more promise for the macroevolutionary view. But it also changes in dramatic ways the way that medical researchers will go about researching how to improve genetic problems. That is, it will likely be much easier to fix an epigenetic based deformity or disease than it has been to change a genetically based deformity or disease.
Professor Rick, can you hear me?
Yeah, Jacob.
Hey, just Jacob. Yes, nice to talk to you. Actually,
yeah.
So so just to piggyback on the epigenetic stuff, in the field of oncology, for example, it's a big thing right now. Most of oncology is pretty much dealing with epigenetic issues. For example, hypermethylation of the tumor suppressor gene will silence them, or hypomethylation would activate the oncogenes, and so on. So that field is really, really exploding, as you mentioned. A lot of the treatments are in that vein, so to speak. We have something called HDAC inhibitors, which are histone deacetylase inhibitors for treating various cancers, leukemias and such, more like T cell leukemias and so on. And then you have myelodysplastic syndrome, etc. Anyway, so yeah, the field is exploding, as you say. My one question for you had to do with um, the uh, the modern biological research that is being done. Um, it makes sense that that has an engine behind it if you were to look at it as a common design platform, or if you look at the world as a common design, you would expect to find, everything you discover, you would expect to have a rationale for it. Whereas if you're looking at random mutations for the diversity of life, you would be expecting so much more of truly junk DNA that you would be mostly landing on nonsense for your research findings. It would probably discourage one, I would think. And so even in that perspective, would it be sensible that a common design background or a way of thinking would lead to more enthusiastic scientists? Because that's how we all behave.
Yeah, I get exactly what you're saying, Jacob, and I think that's true. I think we'd progress a whole lot faster if we were able to set aside the purposeless, designless evolutionary view and assume that everything has purpose, and it's our job to find that purpose. But I don't think that the average practicing scientist allows that to be a problem for him. That is, when I was a kid, they took your tonsils and your appendix out without even thinking about it at the first sign of irritation, because they assumed that they were the vestigial remnants, the useless remnants of an evolutionary process. Subsequent researchers obviously have found that there is purpose, ongoing purpose today for the human appendix and tonsils and such. But I think the people who continued that research didn't necessarily make the conscious claim that I'm going to abandon a purposeless evolutionary view and adopt a teleological view. They just weren't satisfied with the conclusion that there was no purpose. So they probably weren't operating consciously at a metaphysical level and rejecting the purposeless aspect of evolutionism in favor of a theistic or teleological approach, but they did it anyway. And I would say that there's a sense in which, as we wrestle with the fact that evolutionism is still so popular, even though it's not true of the world in which we live, we should take hope from the fact that nature is what it is. Nature is resilient and is not going to continue to tell a false story, and that as researchers open themselves up to following the evidence where it leads, more and more scientists will discover that, in fact, the world in which we live was well designed, and the living things that share the planet with us and that are found in the fossil record were uniquely created and well designed for their time on Earth and the ecologies of which they were a part.
Can I ask just one more quick thing, since you asked to bring it up later?
Sure.
So the recurrent laryngeal nerve thing, so you said you were going to cover that a little more. And the only question I would pose there is, in human beings, I mentioned this in our class in the paper, it kind of helps us diagnose cancers a little faster, actually, in humans. But as far as the giraffe goes, when I was writing about it, I was looking into what the rationale would be. There's so many other innervations as it goes up, besides coming off of the vagus nerve. So so there is design in there too. I don't know if they.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think all of that is true and good, and we could probably, if that was our concern, was to find how exquisitely designed that nerve is, we could probably go on and discover more and more about why the creator did it that way. and I like your answers. My answer would be more basic, and that is that in pretty much all mammals, um, the organs develop before the nerves do, and so when the nerves are developing, they're actually shooting out with targets in mind, if you will. That is, there needs to be a nerve that reaches not only the larynx of the giraffe, but all the other parts. And in most mammals, um, all of that nervous system starts with the vagus nerve, which is at the back of the brain, behind the spinal column, and branches into about 12 other main nerve arteries, if you will. I'm sure arteries is not the right word for that, but um, and needs to disperse throughout the entire body to innervate every organ and tissue part of the body. And it's known that nerves grow best in bundles. That is, if we just had every part of the body receiving its own nerve that started uniquely at the vagus or at the brainstem, that would be a whole lot different than the exquisite design that we actually see, which is 12 main branches of nerves going out and then little by little dividing into different parts of the body to reach every part, every tissue and cell. So a couple of analogies I think might be helpful. If I were to give you directions to my house, I would not give you the shortest, most direct directions because it would involve more turns and more unpaved roads and would be much harder for me to convey to you and much harder for you to follow. What I would do would keep you on the main road, the highway, and then the main roads that you might even have familiarity with before I ever tell you how to get to my house. So that while it may be a longer route, it will be a much easier route for you to traverse. And I think that's kind of what's going on with this recurrent nerve in the giraffe's neck. It's following the highway as long as it can before branching off to another good nerve that in turn branches off again and again, innervating all the tissues in between before arriving at its target of the larynx. Another analogy would be the hot water piping in your house. Let's say you've got piping to all your existing utilities that carries hot water, and then you put in a new upstairs bathroom. Well, one option would be to run a pipe all the way from the hot water heater directly to that new bathroom, but it would be much more economical and efficient to tap into one of the existing pipes that runs to your other bathroom or to your washer or your dishwasher, even though the resulting entire route from the water heater to the new bathroom would be longer than the direct route if you were to make an entirely new pipe directly from the boiler to your new bathroom. So that's the sort of analogy that would get at what's going on in the giraffe's neck that would refute Dawkins's claim of poor design. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Yep, thank you.
Rick, what was Dawkins' objection? Why was he saying it was a poor design?
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I didn't explain that well. So the nerve that innervates the larynx in the giraffe's neck goes from the brainstem well beyond, farther down the neck before curving back to innervate the larynx. And so this was clunky and poor design as far as Dawkins was concerned. And I apologize for not making that clear.
Hello.
I just wanted to comment, Rick. I've been very interested in this subject for quite a long time, and what you said is wonderful. I just completely agree with everything you said. But I was wondering, you mentioned earlier that this is really almost like a kiss of death for a biologist to say that you don't believe in evolution. How has this affected you personally? Has this been a problem for you?
No, not really. I mean, I did very clearly recognize that several of my undergraduate professors uh, felt it their role to denigrate any religious belief, and
Hmm.
Christianity in particular. But by the time I went to graduate school, um, it wasn't an issue. But again, I would say that's partly because evolutionary theory is just that. It's a theoretical discipline that has no bearing on your ability to be a good student of birds of prey, for example. So none of my examinations or research depended on my paying homage to evolutionary theory in any way. And then I only have a master's degree in biology, and then I set up my own company and have done research for 35 years in the field of ornithology and ecology without really answering to anybody who would either deny me a contract on the basis of my skepticism of evolution, or what have you. So it's really more in academia that it can be a problem, and certainly as professors at university uh, have come out of the closet, as if you will, with their skepticism of Darwinism, it has led to their biology colleagues trying to uh, force the university to deny tenure and that sort of thing. So it is a problem, but it doesn't have to be a problem, and particularly if your area of study uh, is a practical one and has nothing to do with whether or not you bow down to the idol of evolutionism.
It turns out that I'm actually not a local Sacramento guy. I'm over in Los Altos, and I have a different organization called Let the Evidence Speak. And I would love to have you come and talk to us sometime.
Same talk, Kirby?
Yeah, sure. Why not? I'm the only one here from that organization.
Okay. Yeah, let's get together and talk about that. I think you probably have my
I
email.
do. I do. We may have talked before, but anyway, yeah.
We do borrow speakers from Kirby's group too. So
I just wanted to talk about that giraffe thing again. Another analogy that you might be able to use, or that I was thinking about, was I work for a software company. And what happens is that we have a lot of people that will look at how the software is acting, and they'll say, boy, that just seems backwards, or that just seems ridiculous. So then you go to the designers and say, can we change this? Or can we make it so that it makes more sense to the user or something like that? And they say, well, the reason we made this decision was, and then they'll talk for a half an hour about all the intricacies and all the reasons why they made the software do what it did, which is not obvious to the casual
Sure.
person. And I probably you'd see that in many, many designs. You look at a car or something, you say, why'd they have to put the cup holder like that? Well, maybe it's because if they didn't do that, then they'd have a problem with it was something much more critical. But for the casual observer, they don't they don't know what went into it. Just like what you said about we can't assume we know everything God is thinking. So I just thought that was a
Yeah, I think that's right. And I take the position that all living things are the product of exquisite design beyond our imagination. Although there is some de-evolution going on, we are accumulating mutations and such. We're actually not evolving at all. We're devolving. But I would look for exquisite design in everything we study in the living world, and there may be trade-offs. that we don't understand, optimization of different considerations that look like they might be not be ideal, but,
Right.
but we don't know the other problem that had to come into consideration. With things like junk DNA, the other issue with living things is that we're finding that there are many things that are not useful to the adult of a species, but that played a significant role during a very specific point
Sure.
in embryology. And so their existence in the individual is because they had use at one particular point in development and are not used at all as an adult. But we look at the fact that they're not being used as an adult and say, oh, it's useless. So that's another consideration that needs to be looked at when you're looking for the purpose for what seems to be a purposeless or poorly designed thing.
Well, you mentioned the tonsil thing and you were saying that evolution doesn't have any practical applications, but I might actually argue that evolution does have some anti-practical
Exactly.
applications.
Yeah.
And so it does actually affect how some fields of science actually progress or digress.
Sure.
Possibly in a bad way.
Sure. I would say that naturalism and evolutionism hold back good science.
Yeah. One thing I did want to ask you that I don't quite understand is epigenetics. I'm not a biologist, and this whole epigenetic thing is complicated in my mind. I'm kind of viewing it as like these little switches or something that happen maybe on the DNA or something that activates a gene or something like that. My question is when just thinking of it that way, it seems as though that would be hereditary, and the switches would be hereditary. And if it's hereditary, wouldn't that be basically the same arguments you'd use for DNA as you would for the epigenetics? Something I'm not understanding there. Maybe you could fill me in there.
Well, again, the genome is exquisitely designed.
Right.
But now we recognize through epigenetic research that the cells have multiple other layers of exquisite design that can affect heredity without resulting in what we would observe as a gene mutation. And so it's not just on the DNA, these other. So a couple of examples are what's called methylation, whereas a methyl group is attached to a particular part of the DNA that changes the way that DNA is read. But epigenetics is young, and I believe that these other influences on the DNA that come from other parts of the cell, I think we're only discovering the tip of the iceberg at this point. And these epigenetic effects seem to be very responsive to changes in the cell's environment or the organism's environment or the amount of some particular nutrient coming in now that wasn't coming in before. So while the DNA itself is exquisitely designed and has a huge role to play in the survival of the cell and the formation of other cell types and things like that, it's not the whole story. And the rest of the story screams design any way you look at it.
So we don't all dance to our DNA. It's other things we dance to too.
Yes, and you can pass on not just your genome, but your epigenome. That is your genome with these changes in on-off switches and dimmers. And I know that's kind of a clunky analogy, but I don't want to get into the weeds of the actual chemistry going on. But again, when we identify things like methyl groups that are part of this epigenetic phenomenon, we're just identifying the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot more going on, both to prevent gene mutations from occurring and to allow the cell and the species and even the population to adapt to environmental changes in a real-time way.
when I look at the difference between when people are when you want to compare design to, say, naturalism, it seems as though DNA and the epigenetics would kind of fall into the same category in the sense that they both have whatever argument you would use for the DNA, you would also use for the epigenetics because it's hereditary. And so couldn't you argue, oh, there's a mutation in the epigenetics now or something, or doesn't it work that way?
No, I think it does work that way. I think epigenetics, when the evolutionary community really gets a handle on epigenetics, it will provide a much more satisfactory explanation for microevolution, changes within a species,
Okay.
than the old single random gene mutation that is so fit producing that within several generations it traverses the entire population. So I think epigenetics will offer a very powerful, better explanation for evolutionists as far as microevolution. But I don't think it gets them anywhere beyond microevolution.
It does make you wonder about the definition of evolution now, because now it's like that doesn't even sound like the original evolution anymore. I mean, it's this totally very, very different thing now that's going on.
It sounds a whole lot like Lamarckianism.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. Yes, I remember we had that
refuted by Darwinism.
Right. We talked about Lamarckianism in our 10th grade biology class, and basically everybody laughed at it.
Right.
And now it's kind of coming back again.
Yeah, this epigenetic phenomenon has an echo of Lamarckianism.
All right. Well, thank you.
Do you have any examples of a conversation you had with a evolutionist where you felt like you were making progress and changing their mind? Or what kind of facts you think might have planted a seed to them?
Well, again, I think that most evolutionists are suffering with a cognitive bias that really prevents them from even considering that the arguments and sets of evidences that they use might not be satisfactory. So the answer is probably no to your question, and I wouldn't even, unless it were a real close friend, I wouldn't even try to convince somebody that evolution isn't true. If I know that they're a staunch evolutionist, instead I would just do what Greg Koukl calls put a pebble in their shoe, and just try to offer one piece of evidence that I think would cause them to ruminate and not be able to respond well to. But most of my apologetics along this line would be with younger people or with people who are open to understanding, and especially Christians who are confused by the claim that all biologists believe in evolution, and that doesn't seem to be what my Bible says. So most of my apologetic endeavors have been to open-minded people and not to my colleagues who are staunch evolutionists working under a cognitive bias that they can't overcome.
You know, people in the STEM field, one of the things I've noticed was they accept from authority that this has been settled science, and they can't even entertain the thought. You know, when you go through the problems of evolution, for example, it's just they think we're pulling the wool over their eyes or something of that sort. But one thing that affected a friend of mine recently is, we were studying in class about methodological naturalism, and then the philosophical naturalism part came up, and I mentioned that to him. I said, there's a philosophical position that you will not deviate from. When that light clicked on, it was fun to see his mind thinking, you're right. There would be no scenario in which I would give another worldview a chance, because forget the methodological naturalism part where my experiments are set up in that way. Whatever the results show, we will twist the triangle to fit into a square, something of that sort. You'll try to make it fit, and even though it won't fit. But that idea clicked. It was interesting to see he's starting to have that pebble in the shoe effect.
Yeah, that's good. I should point out that there's a much bigger picture here. Darwin's theory of evolution was meant to explain just one of the big questions that science ought to be able to explain, and that was how life on Earth became as diverse as we see in the fossil record and in what's alive today. It has no explanation for all the other big questions that science ought to be answering, such as the origin of the universe, the fact that there's order in the universe, the fact that our place in the universe seems exquisitely designed, the fact that the universe itself as a whole seems to be exquisitely designed to allow for life on Earth. It doesn't explain the origin of first life. Evolutionists see that as a completely different issue than the subsequent evolution of life. It doesn't explain the origin of consciousness of animals, much less of human beings. It doesn't even explain, morality. It doesn't explain such things as why, as a scientist, I need to be honest about my research and my results. All of those things are well explained, come from a Christian theist, a Judeo-Christian worldview. And all those things are necessary to make science a worthwhile endeavor. But they're all either unexplained by or directly at odds with a naturalist and an evolutionist understanding of the world.
Not only that, but it also doesn't explain things in life, such as how do cells change? How does one cell change into another cell? And don't tell me it's with proteins, because I can tell you why it's not.
Right.
And also, what is the body plan for, say, a human or a cat or whatever, and where is it? And if there's not one, how in the world then are we the same critter, when we breed and have another one like us, and it turns out to look a lot like us? If there's not a body plan, how can that be?
Yeah.
If it was a 777 jet, there's a body plan for that. Isn't there somewhere a body plan for every critter?
Yeah, and in biology, it's generally been understood that the DNA is somehow that body plan.
Yeah, but I can tell you reasons why it can't be.
Forgetting for the moment that it's the same DNA in every cell that yields a different tissue type and all that. But I don't know if you were on the call that Fuzz had with Bill Dembski here a few months ago. And one of the things Bill said, which was worth the price of admission to me, and I forget even what the question was, but the phrase Bill said was something like, I have vitalist tendencies, or I have vitalist leanings. And I wanted to shout, amen. And what Bill was saying there was, there used to be a belief in vitalism, which basically said that there is something immaterial about each individual and each species that contributes to making that individual and species what it is. And it wasn't refuted by naturalist scientists. It was merely discarded as not within the pale as far as naturalism is concerned. And I believe that vitalism is correct, that we will never find a strictly physicalist explanation for how the same DNA makes all the different cell types and tissue types and such, that there is in fact something immaterial going on. And even if DNA were the blueprint, there needs to be a contractor to come along and read that blueprint and direct the construction of the building. And
That's right.
I take it that there's an immaterial component to that head contractor.
Right. I think we're on the same page.
Rick, as an ornithologist, and particularly looking at birds of prey, have you found examples in your field that would be helpful for us in an apologetics situation?
Well, I don't think my answer will get it exactly at what you're saying, but I do want to be able to say this, that if as a Christian you accept evolutionism as the folks at Biologist do, then when Jesus tells you to consider the birds of the air, to learn about the Father's design and care and provision for them, you end up really worshiping a process that intervenes between the creator sustainer and that eagle or owl. Okay, so I have made a career of taking very seriously Jesus's command to consider the birds of the air. And everywhere I look in the design and provision for the golden eagle and the spotted owl and every form of bird that I've studied, I can truly worship the creator, designer, provider directly, rather than having a little idol of natural selection come between me and that creator. And so I think we are commanded, even when we're not in the field of biology. I think as worshipers of God, we are commanded to look at his creation and discover in it his glory and his provision and his love and his care, and give him praise for all that. And if we allow natural selection to come between us in that worship, we're really doing both the Bible and the Creator a real disservice.
Yeah, thank you. There is so much to worship by seeing what God's done in nature.
Yeah.
Yes. We have time for maybe another question if anyone has a question.
Hi, Rick. I'm in Oklahoma here. I appreciate it very much. I'm in your class, and I'm very much a fish out of water here. I don't have a biology background. I'm not a scientist in any sort, but I really do love this stuff. Going back to the slides, and I think this was a part of a quote from Gould, but I didn't quite write his name down. Transitional forms are extremely rare. Does that also mean they don't exist at all?
Well, yeah, I would argue that that's the case. And this, your question allows me to explain a little bit further. So those paleontologists, Gould and Eldritch and Stanley, whom I quoted there, they're still committed evolutionists. They were just boldly and forthrightly saying that the fossil record does not bear out Darwinian gradualism. And so they actually, the three of them got together and promoted a new idea, which was called punctuated equilibrium. They're still naturalists, and they still don't believe in a creator or anything like that. But they were straightforwardly saying that new species don't arise through the sort of gradualism that we've been claiming all along. Instead, they arise all of a sudden, fully formed, and everything they said fits in perfectly with a creationist view.
Okay? Right, special creation. Yeah.
They were their idea of punctuated equilibrium didn't really ever produce a mechanism by which they claim that these sudden new radiations and arising of new forms occurred. And so, nobody's really carrying the torch for that punctuated equilibrium today, but they really were calling out the fact that the fossil record does not support Neo-Darwinianism.
I thought they were kind of shouted down on that punctuated equilibrium thing. The whole idea was rejected uh, by biologists. Is that not correct?
Well, it was rejected, but mainly because they didn't offer a mechanism to replace, gene mutations, random selection.
But I mean, a rejection for the very fact that they're just pointing out that really happens with species. So they were giving an example of, show me a species that it doesn't exist in, that it's not punctuated equilibrium, and all species are that way, aren't they? I think.
Yeah. So they're being shouted down was basically the power of the existing paradigm.
Right.
Silenced them.
And yet nobody was able to show that they were wrong.
Right. Exactly.
My own suspicion also is that the world of epigenetics is going to really mess up this whole situation for them, in the sense that that is thought to be one of the main ways by which you protect your genome. And trying to get mutations to get something different, I don't think it's going to pan out when the epigenetics gets more informed or more flushed out. I think that because that's where all of our cancer stuff is going on. All the mutations are happening in the epigenetic side of things. And and when you have a mutation, then you have a disease that kills the agent, it kills the human. Right. And so I don't know if I think their field is going to go further backwards to the death spiral if the epigenetics gets more fully discovered in the upcoming, even probably in 2 to 5 years, because of all the AI stuff that's going on.
Good, Jacob. Thanks.
Well, I will need to draw this to a close. We're about ready to get kicked out of the building here. So Rick, thank you again. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise with us. It's been a wonderful evening, and we really appreciate all your information and your presentation.
My pleasure, Randy.
And we get applause in the room here. Next month, we will be having Hugh Ross here, who you cited, and he will be speaking on the topic of his Noah's Flood Revisited, his most recent book. Kirby actually had him at his meeting, I think, about a year ago. Mm-hmm. So we've borrowed Hugh, which is a good borrow. So we would invite you all to come back. We are possibly, and I haven't confirmed this, but hopefully we'll have books here for those of you who can attend in person. Sorry we can't get them to you online, but if you can come here, we'd love to have you. So that'll be our March meeting. So with that, I will say good night. And again, thank you, Rick. And we hope to see you all back in March for Hugh's presentation. Thank you.